Welcome all, and thank you for joining the Atlantic Council Syria project for this event to explore investment opportunities in Northwest Syria. First of all, I want to welcome those who are joining us from the United States, Europe, and the region, Turkey and Syria. And as you may know, the economical situation in Syria is of particular importance in this period of time, especially when international aid, international funding for humanitarian aid projects are decreasing due to the Gaza conflict and the invasion of Ukraine. And in this manner, investments into Northwest Syria, where a huge United Nations humanitarian mission is ongoing, might be of help. And in this particular context, the U.S. Department of Treasury declared General License Number 22 authorizing activities in certain economic sectors in non-regime held areas in northeastern and northwestern Syria. And this waiver allows for transactions for certain activities like agriculture, information, power grid, transportation, etc. We will hear more about this soon. And today we will try to discuss with a group of distinguished guests the potential of investments and the opportunities as well as the limitations. So I am today honored to discuss this with Kenton Slaughter, a Syria Desk Officer in the State Department's Office of Levant Affairs, or Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs. Welcome, Kenton. And I am honored to discuss this as well with Jomana Hadou, the Senior Syria Advisor in the State Department's Office of Levant Affairs, Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs. Welcome to you as well, Jomana. And Ambassador Erman Önhan, the last Turkish ambassador to Syria, who served there just up until the early days of the Syrian civil war, and a board member of the Ankara Policy Center in Turkey. Lastly, we have with us Sinan Hatahed, a non-residential senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and vice president for investment and social impact at the Syrian Forum. Welcome to both of you, Ambassador and Sinan. So before we start, I would like to remind our audience, if you have any questions at any point during the event, please go to askec.org, that is askec.org, to ask any questions you may have during the event. I would try to ask these questions to our speakers, and we would try to discuss this. So before we start, as we have known, the general license issue is the Kickstarter for this. We have approximately 1.5 years since General License Number 22 was declared. And we are now in an area in which many Syrian businessmen have used this general license to invest in Northwest Syria. But to understand the sanctions regime on Syria and to understand the general license and what it encompasses and what it waivers in terms of sanctions, I want to start with Kenton Slaughter. Kenton, welcome again. What is the situation? What is the overall perspective in terms of sanctions? And what does General License Number 22 actually mean? Can you explain this to us?
Well, good morning, and thank you, Omer and the Atlantic Council, for this opportunity to discuss U.S. policy regarding investment in Northwest Syria. Regarding our sanctions, so the United States maintains robust economic sanctions and export controls in Syria. These are largely in response to the government of Syria's support for terrorism and its actions to destabilize Lebanon, as well as its human rights abuse, public corruption, and its response to the Syrian uprising, among other malign activities. Our sanctions and export controls are set forth in congressional legislation, executive orders, and Treasury and commerce regulations. So separating the two, sanctions and export controls, U.S. sanctions on Syria are administered by the Department of the Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC. And they do the following. First, they block the property and interest in property of the government of Syria, as well as the property, interests, and property of any other persons that have been determined by the Secretary of State in consultation, or Secretary of the Treasury, rather, in consultation with the Secretary of State to meet certain criteria, including sanctionable behavior that are described in the executive orders. 2, they prohibit transactions or dealings with foreign persons that are determined to meet these criteria. And third, they prohibit certain other transactions with respect to Syria that are described in our executive orders. And these include A, new investment in Syria by a U.S. person, wherever that person is located. B, the direct or indirect exportation, re-exportation, sale, or supply of any services to Syria from the United States or by a U.S. person, wherever located. C, the importation into the United States of petroleum or petroleum products of Syrian origin. D, any transaction or dealing by a U.S. person in or related to petroleum or petroleum products of Syrian origin. And E, any approval, financing, facilitation, or guarantee by a U.S. person of a transaction by a foreign person where that transaction by the foreign person would be prohibited if performed by a U.S. person or within the United States. Now, separately, U.S. export controls related to Syria are administered by the Department of Commerce's Bureau of Industry and Security, or BIS, and they include prohibitions on 1, the export to Syria of all items on the Commerce Control List, and the export to Syria of products of the United States, with certain exceptions such as food and most medicines. And 2, they include prohibitions on landings or overflights of the United States by Syrian aircraft, with, again, certain limited exceptions, such as emergencies or flights that are transporting Syrian government officials to the United States on official business, for example, to go to the UN. In addition, the Caesar-Syria Civilian Protection Act, passed in 2019, requires the president to impose mandatory sanctions on foreign persons who knowingly provide significant support to or engage in significant transactions with the government of Syria, as well as those who engage in other categories of activities. So these prohibitions, both regarding our sanctions and export controls, apply to all parts of Syria, unless otherwise authorized by OFAC and/or BIS. Now, our Syria sanctions regulations include several authorizations, general licenses, for certain activities by certain actors that would otherwise be prohibited under those regulations. So, for example, the sanctions regulations we have contain general licenses for activities of the US government, the UN, and NGOs, and then, of course, General License 22. Our export controls also contain some limited exceptions, but both OFAC and BIS have the authority to issue specific licenses on a case-by-case basis for any activities or services that aren't covered by a general license or an exception. So that may sound pretty comprehensive, but it doesn't cover the full breadth of our sanctions regulations or export controls. All of these can be found online, and so I would strongly encourage anyone who's considering investment or other activities in Syria to closely review these regulations and to reach out to OFAC and BIS respectively with any questions. Now, specifically regarding Syria General License 22, as you mentioned, in May 2022, OFAC issued this general license. It authorizes U.S. persons to engage in activities in 12 economic sectors in certain non-regime held areas of Northwest and Northeast Syria that would otherwise be prohibited under the Syria sanctions regulations. So to run through these sectors is agriculture, information and telecommunications, power grid infrastructure, construction, finance, clean energy, transportation and warehousing, water and waste management, health services, education, manufacturing, and trade. The general license, the text of the general license is online on OFAC's website. OFAC's website also contains a number of FAQs that explain in more detail what the general license covers. One of these is FAQ 1043, which contains more information on the economic sectors, including some example types of activities that are covered under each economic sector. The geographical areas, the non-regime areas, include Aleppo, Raqqa, Deir ez-Zor, and Hasaka governorates, but they exclude certain districts from that. And then again, there are more details on the scope of that in the FAQs and in the text of the general license itself. General License 22 also authorizes U.S. financial institutions to process funds transfers that are in support of the activities conducted in those economic sectors. And separately, non-U.S. persons, including foreign financial institutions, will not face any sanctions risk under the Caesar Act for engaging or facilitating any transactions that are authorized or exempt for U.S. persons under GL22 or other general licenses in our serious sanctions regulations. Now, there are some caveats to this authorization. First, General License 22 does not authorize any transactions with the government of Syria, designated terrorists, or any other person who's been sanctioned by the United States. The license also does not authorize the importation into the United States of petroleum or petroleum products of Syrian origin that are prohibited by our sanctions regulations. And then, most importantly, General License 22 only authorizes activities that are prohibited by the Syria sanctions regulations. So it does not authorize activities or transactions that are prohibited by other sanctions regulations that we have, such as our counterterrorism sanctions or other country-specific sanctions regulations. And it doesn't waive any export license requirements. So investors will need to conduct their own due diligence and will need to consult the OFAC sanctions list and other sanctions regulations to make sure that they're complying with our sanctions. As I mentioned before, information on General License 22 is available on OFAC's website. That license includes an annex to it that lists out the specific geographic scope of the license. And again, the FAQs online provide a lot more information on both the scope of the economic sectors, the geographic areas, and due diligence expectations for investors. And I would strongly encourage anyone considering investing in Northwest or Northeast Syria to reach out to OFAC with any questions or doubts that they have. So with that, I thank you again for this opportunity, and I'll turn it to the next speaker.
Kenton, if I may exploit my moderator role here a little bit. I wonder, and it popped up as you said about the potential investors. Do potential investors need a special license, or can they work if they work in line with general license? They don't need any special license. What is the procurement there? And if they need one, how can I apply for that? Can you elaborate on this a little bit more?
Sure, yeah, I can speak in general terms about that. So OFAC's general licenses are designed to be self-executing. So that means that if an investor wants to do any activity in Syria, they should review the general licenses. If the activity is covered under that general license, then they're free to operate under that general license. If they have any doubts about whether or not the activity that they're engaged in is covered under the general license, then they should reach out to OFAC directly for guidance. OFAC has a website, OFAC_feedback@treasury.gov, where they can send an email to OFAC, and OFAC will respond with guidance on whether or not the activity is covered under the general license or whether they will need a specific license to conduct that activity. So the economic sectors in the general license cover a broad range of activities, but there may be some activities in there that aren't covered. Either they're outside of the geographic scope, or the activity falls outside of one of those economic sectors, or may involve other actors that are not covered by the general license. So for all of those questions, they should reach out to OFAC first for guidance. And then if OFAC determines that a specific license will be needed, OFAC will provide information on how to go about requesting a specific license. I believe OFAC's website has a portal there where investors or others can submit license requests. There's an application process for that. But really, I would say the main advice is to reach out to OFAC for both in terms of getting guidance on the activity and on submitting license requests for that. And then with a caveat, as I mentioned earlier, we have separate U.S. export controls that relate to the re-exportation, sale of services or goods to Syria. So those are managed by the Department of Commerce. They're not managed by the Department of the Treasury. So I think it will behoove investors to make sure that they're considering both our sanctions and our export regulations, just to make sure that they're in compliance. because even if something is covered under the general license, they may still need to apply for export licenses to be able to export any equipment to Syria.
So thanks, Kenton, for elaborating on the technical aspects of the general license and the sanctions. And I think it was quite informative to understand that the scope of the sanctions, economic sanctions regarding Syria, and what kind of waivers we are speaking here about actually, and that everyone has to do diligence to make sure that their actions are within the waivers and the regulations. And from there on, I want to move towards Jomana. And Jomana, if you may, can you elaborate a bit more on the US perspective regarding investments in Northwest Syria? How has this general license came up, and what is the idea of the US in terms of potential investors? How do the US government and the US state view this entire investment topic and issue?
No, good morning or good afternoon to everybody. Thank you, Omar and the Atlantic Council, for hosting us. And really many thanks to my colleague, Kenton, who laid out really GL22 very well. You know, I don't think it should come as a surprise to anyone. The administration has been prioritizing and has really been advocating for the operationalizing of GL22 since it was put in effect. It's absolutely a priority for us. And you know, GL22 really came out of the desire for the US government and to build on its de-ISIS strategy. So it was intended to improve the economic conditions in non-regime held areas, both in Northwest and in Northeast Syria. And really, the intent of this was to help provide a vehicle to stabilize the region. Many of us who are very familiar with the humanitarian conditions in Syria will tell you very openly that humanitarian funding and aid has absolutely decreased globally over the last several years. Now, thankfully, you know, U.S. Government numbers are still comparable. You know, what we're expecting for 2024 are comparable to 2023, but with the many different humanitarian crises across the region, you know, we expect that this is going to alter the environment and you know, the playing field in a lot of these areas that have been highly dependent on humanitarian aid. And so really the purpose of GL22 is to try to create a legal avenue for investors to be able to support you know, populations that are frankly looking for ways to find sustainable ways of making, you know, creating jobs, creating livelihoods. And I've had the chance, we've had several, you know, Syrian American individuals, organizations, et cetera, come to us and talk to us about how they are themselves putting, you know, this into effect and how they're looking, you know, whether to clean energy or encouraging investors. I know the Syrian American community, for example, has been very active in trying to promote GL22 and looking for investors. And this is something that, you know, fits within, like I said, our objectives in GL22. We do believe wholeheartedly that after 13 years of war, the Syrian people are in need of really serious investment, especially in areas like education, healthcare, restoration of homes, internet access. Those are all vital. And GL22, as Kenton outlined, provides for all of that. Now, you know, there are GL22 does go over, it carves out specific areas that fall under GL22, both in Northwest and Northeast Syria. It is notable that probably two areas are not included there, Afrin as well as Idlib. And the US government, you know, has part of its greater Syria policy does include, you know, adherence to human rights concerns. And so for those reasons, those two areas have been left out. In Idlib in particular, there is always concern about Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and the areas governed by that group. And so those areas are excluded. But large swaths of northern Syria are included in this. And so we, you know, we obviously encourage investors to look at GL22, see what fits within those sectors, and to absolutely put their money to good use in supporting these populations. With, you know, we recognize that there are still, despite, you know, GL22's facilitation of this in a legal, from a legal perspective. We know that there's challenges. I don't know if you wanted to go into those now, but we're aware that there's challenges that still, a lot of investors that we've spoken to are working through and are trying to work through neighboring countries as well to find solutions to these problems. But I'll stop there because I want to give you an opportunity. I'm not sure if you want me to go on into the challenges or.
Hey, go on. I don't want to stop you. You are muted still.
Okay, so I mean, despite the fact that GL22 offers this opportunity, we're also talking about an area that has been ravaged by war. Northern Syria itself has really been through a lot in most recent years. And even in the very recent months, we know there has been an absolute uptick in violence in northwest Syria. And so first and foremost, the ongoing conflict across northern Syria is one of the major hurdles for, to convincing investors that they should be investing in this area, because it's very possible that their buildings, their, manufacturing companies, whatever it is that they're investing in, can absolutely be destroyed in a war that has not completely come, to a standstill. And it's something that obviously maintaining ceasefires is one of the 4 pillars of the US government and something we absolutely encourage. And so while that's going on, that's going to remain a challenge and an obstacle to overcome. Second, we know banking infrastructure, including lack of a SWIFT code, remains absolutely an obstacle. We know that neighboring countries, be it in Jordan or in Turkey, have been contemplating ways of extending, their banking services into northern Syria. We have yet to see something sustainable in this regard, but we know that this is something that makes it very difficult. Hawala transfers are still the primary way, I think, for many people of getting their money into northern Syria, but obviously being able to encourage investors to send large sums of money to support various, production centers, manufacturing centers, etc., does require a reliable banking system. And so we understand that that's a second major hurdle. The third is, lack of sustainable legal framework and a court system to go along with it. Now, we know that both in Northwest and Northeast Syria, there have been attempts to create a legal framework that would sort of govern consumer, the consumer and the business, the business relationship, as well as the business and the investors. But there really isn't a robust legal system as of yet that would apply, and court systems that would apply this consistently across the board. And so that's a third obstacle that I think exists, and we need to be able to, admit it and find ways of addressing it, or encourage investors and local governing authorities actually to find ways of addressing it in order to make this encourage more investments. There's another issue which I think it becomes kind of out of a lot of the northern Syria's hands, which is that the lack of certificates of origin for a lot of products. The Syrian government, and I'm sure Sinan actually could probably speak to this much better, but from our understanding, they maintain a monopoly on providing certificates of origin for Syrian businesses. And so it becomes very difficult for for businesses outside of government-held areas to be able to obtain those. And so exporting goods outside of Syria becomes more difficult. If not, I don't think it's fully impossible, but I do think it becomes more difficult when you don't have that. And finally, the fact that there's no adequate insurance. Going back to my first point on obstacles, the key issue with, being, still an ongoing conflict, or even if goods are destroyed or robbed, etc., it's really hard to convince anyone to insure these goods, just given the many variables that exist in northern Syria. And so we know that a lot of these investors are high-risk investors, people who want to invest in northern Syria because they want to give back to northern Syria and help the people there have access to sustainable livelihood. But we do understand that for the average, American, it is not going to be the, the safest place necessarily to invest in the immediate term, just because given all these variables and, that are really have not been resolved. And so these are some of the things we're consciously aware of. We know that neighboring countries, like I said, are aware of them too, including Turkey, and look forward to hearing the ambassador's comments, hopefully, on that. But all in all, we hope that, the U.S. government really intended on this to be a vehicle for, lawful investment in northern Syria, really signaling that we support that, but understand that that alone is not going to open the floodgates for, investment the next day, given the challenges that I outlined. So over to you.
Okay, great. Thanks for that, Jumana. And I think it was very important, this one sentence you said, people who want to give back to Syria. I think this is a huge part of the motivation for potential investors, also to have the humanitarian perspective in what they're doing, not only to make money, but also to help the people. And with that, I want to go to the ambassador and Mr. Ernhorn. You were in Syria in the early days of the civil war. You have seen the pre-war Syria. You have taught and you have extensively written about your experience in Syria as an ambassador. But now, looking at the current situation, how do you see the Turkish perspective in terms of investments to Northwest Syria? How does this align with the Turkish strategy generally in Syria? And I wonder, what kind of potential do you assess for investments in Northwest Syria? And please go ahead with your presentation, and don't forget to unmute you, please.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you for inviting me to this very interesting event. It has been educating to hear the previous speakers. If you allow me, I'm not going to go into the specifics of northwest of Syria or northern Syria, but share with you some general thoughts, because I think when we address the issue, we should address it within, seeing the full picture and not just a part of it. Now, Syria is treated as if everything is solved and the crisis have come to an end, which is not the case, of course. Yes, the attention of the world may be on Ukraine and Gaza, but Syrian crisis is still very much alive, and I think there is a very serious, acute humanitarian catastrophe over there. Plus, it is still a powder keg ready to explode at any moment. Now, how does economy affect the Syrians? I would really refer it to under two titles. One of them is the effect on Syrians who still remain in Syria. Just think that 90% or more than 90% of the people live below the poverty line over there. And the second aspect is, of course, the effect on the return of around 6-7 million Syrians abroad. People do not return to Syria for the sake of returning, but they will only return if they feel safe over there and if there are opportunities awaiting them. Now, in Syria, we have seen that there are different zones of governance over there. One is the area which is held by the regime now, and other areas in Idlib, in the northwest part of Syria and northeast part of Syria. And economic conditions and difficulties, challenges in each area is very different than each other. Now, the regime area is maybe the worst of within these areas. There is real suffering over there, and it is even the case that people from the regime areas are fleeing to northeast and northwest to have some relief on their economic conditions. Now, sanctions have been an important part of US policy, but how effective it has been and to what extent it serves the purposes is something to be very seriously discussed, because there are contradictions. I mean, on the one hand, we want to have sanctions on the regime or the oppressor, but then on the other hand, you want to keep aid coming in and to have the economy functioning. And unfortunately, that is not really possible in many cases. So it should be debated. I mean, it's a matter of debate as to whether the sanctions have really produced the desired result or not. Now, if you look at Damascus, you will see today that President Assad and his entourage, his circles are richer than they were before the war. I mean, they have had so many opportunities for making big financial gains, and it's no secret that an important part of these gains are derived from, are somehow related directly or indirectly to sanctions. So the war economy has also shown its space in Syria and has produced its rich elites and so on. Now, coming to specifically to northern part of Syria, there are purposes for everything, the general license 22 and so on. Now, one of them, of course, is to help relieve people of their hardships that they are facing in economy. And as the previous speaker pointed out, to create employment opportunities, and also cover the lack of infrastructure in many fields, including health, education, and so on. Now, General License 22 is gives a breathing space, but is it enough? That's quite questionable. First of all, if you look at the license, the first thing that you notice is the geographical limitations that it imposes. I mean, as far as I remember, it covers the Euphrates Shield operation area, El-Bab and Azaz and so on, plus Tel Abyad in the Peace Spring operation area. But all the other areas in northwestern Syria remain outside the scope of General License 22. So if we are talking about creating employment opportunities, if we are talking about giving these people a chance in trading their goods and so on, then the geographic scope and also the scope of the list could be expanded. I mean, that is what comes to mind at first. And it should be expanded in a way to cover the areas which are controlled by the interim Syrian government. Now, you mentioned the return of Syrians abroad. I think this is a very important point, especially from a Turkish point of view. I mean, Turkey, as you very well know, hosts about 3.5 million Syrians, and we are working on the voluntary return of Syrians. But return depends on a number of conditions. I mean, you cannot have people return back to their countries by just simply asking them to return. First of all, they have to be sure that they will not be prosecuted when they are back. But also on the economic side, they will return if they are sure that they will find employment, if they will find housing, if they will find education for their children, if they have health opportunities. I mean, if they have these, then they will be able to return. But in order to offer these to the Syrians living in Turkey or elsewhere, you need to revive the economy. And in order to revive the economy, you need more breathing space. So I think license 22 should, general license 22 should also be reviewed within this framework. But then even if you have an improved economy which would encourage Syrians abroad to return, there is still the fear of the regime and other groups over there who could be life-threatening for the returnees. So I think anything that, any step that you take in economy should be based on a concrete political basis. I mean, nothing happens in the air. Everything must have a solid ground to build on. And I think a political solution, without a political solution, no matter what, which steps you take in the economic field, there will always be a very important element missing.
Thank you, Ambassador. And I think it was very important from you to hear that there is an overlapping interest for all involved, that investments could encourage the economy. And I think it was particularly important, your emphasis on the political solution. But there at the moment, the situation is, as the ambassador explained. And Sinan, what would you say? What is the economical situation in Northwest Syria? What are potential areas of investment? What could investors consider to invest? And within this framework, I know that the CM Forum and you have been working on investments in Northwest Syria for quite a time. What are your experiences with investments in Northwest Syria, and can you elaborate on these more? I cannot hear you. Are you mute?
Yeah, thank you, Omer, and good morning, everyone. Regarding Northwest Syria, so we have to take that into, its context. Since the Russian-Turkish agreement in March 2020, so it's now been nearly 4 years and a couple of months since then, there has been a relative calm in the region. Of course, we witnessed some skirmishes here and there, mostly in Idlib, more than in GL22 designated areas. But the general atmosphere that now there is less physical threat of an invasion or a wide armed operations. And we witnessed a group of businessmen, mostly from northern Syria, invest heavily in their own private sector. So this includes businesses and manufacturing, but also in service as well as in trade. And of course, without forgetting real estate, which is, it has its own merits when it comes to quick return of investment. And at the same time, local councils have established a number of industrial zones. The most famous one is in Rai because it's just next to the border, and it's one that has witnessed the biggest growth over the last few years. But we also have a similar one in Azaz, a similar one in El Bab, and now there are discussions to establish one in Aftarin and one in Jarablus. Afrin is also relatively safer when it comes to large armed group, large armed conflict. But since it is not part of the GL22 and it has its own problem when it comes to other social dimensions, including the positioning of the local Kurds, it has its own dynamic when it comes to early recovery and the private sector engagement. What we also witnessed in the last couple of years is the introduction of foreign capital. So it's not foreign capital, meaning that it comes from Turks or from Arab businessmen, but it's rather foreign capital coming from Syrian diaspora, the Syrian diaspora, whether it's in Turkey, mostly from Turkey actually, and a little bit from the US and the EU. In Turkey, it is mostly so they have always been connected to the region. They've been conducting trade, especially if they are working in the production-based industries. They've been selling their own produce in Syria, so they have the access to the market, and this definitely has helped them or encouraged them to move their production activities to Syria because they know how to make money out of it, basically. They are also encouraged to a certain degree and in the domestic difficulties in operating out of Turkey. Part of it is the rising price in labor, which is of course the result of inflation. So they have been attained by the Turkish economic and global problems as much as anyone else. And Syria seems less expensive, less costly, but also because of other political domestic consideration that pushed them to move to Turkey, to Syria. Part of it is the voluntary return, and part of it is also, being able to operate back in their home countries. For the US-based and the West-based business community, they have been mostly encouraged from a social impact point of view. So how can they create a paradigm shift from humanitarian aid and emergency response to a more sustainable model in which they can actually produce and help creating sustainable businesses and sustainable jobs, and hence better return on investment, at least at the local level as well as the local community. Some of them could be interested, and we've seen this as well, in pure economic growth and capital increase. And we've seen this mostly in sectors that are like telecom, as well as real estate development, and very little in production-based economy, to be honest with you. So what we at the Syrian Forum, and we are not the only people working on this, there are many other partners among the Syrian community abroad, as well as within our friends and allies of the West and in Turkey. We've been looking at how we can increase the number of investments in number of investors, as well as in size of investment in production-based economy, because this is the one that has potentially more value in terms of the local hosting communities, as well as in terms of the ability of the Syrian individuals to gain more autonomy. So we've been looking into the infrastructure. The infrastructure still is poor. We have to remember that the local infrastructure has been, even before the war, longly neglected by the regime in this part of the country. And this means that there is there was pure electrification of the region. There is no electrical gas plants, for example. There is no big roads that connect the cities. Water irrigation is also poor. And here, Turkey has played a very positive role. For example, in terms of electrification, we are now buying all our electricity production from Turkish companies, albeit at a high price in comparison to the local consumption, capacity. But still, we are being able to buy electricity, and I think northern Western Syria is the most electrified region in all of Syria, with an uptime around 90% and penetration of around 85% in the worst area, which is Afrin. We also have gained access to telecom, thanks to to companies that are getting their internet connections by high band from Turkey. This is very important because this is the basis of any kind of production economy. Now, there are still things that needs to be enhanced. Jumana Ketan has mentioned them. One of them is the legal and regulatory atmosphere. So we have to recognize that there have been a huge enhancement year over year in terms of rule of law. For example, we witnessed that the military police has been gaining more and more authority over the groups of over the armed groups that constitute the SNA, the Syrian National Army, and this seems that they are much more credible and trusted by the local community, which gives a sense of security. We have also witnessed an increase in local legal infrastructure, also trust. So more and more people are going to local commercial courts to settle their differences, to also are talking more and more to lawyers. Lawyers have also gained more traction and credibility in the local market. Has it yet reached the satisfactory level? No. And here I need to be very clear. However, there has been clear enhancement year over year. The part that has not been enhanced enough is the regulatory part. So if you want to speak about any fintech solutions, for example, or financing, whether it's traditional bank or in technology, there needs to be more regulations that could help some of this risk-taking institutions to come and open in the area. Recently, the US has assisted the Autonomous Administration in Northern Eastern Syria to create the CNPO, which actually acts as a regulator for the finance sector. The same is also, as I understand, being done with Northern Eastern Syria in collaboration with the ITIRAF as well as the SIG, but they haven't yet reached their final conclusion. But the help of this assistance in creating a regulatory body for the finance sector is very important for any other actors that would like to get into this. However, having stated that, Northern Western Syria is the only area where you can actually get international wires through the PTT, which is the Turkish Postal Service. We don't have any kind of similar infrastructure in Northern Eastern Syria, or even in Damascus, even though we do have the local Ram Damascus, based Syrian banks. Some of them which do still operate out of Lebanon, but as a legal or let's say safe way to wire money, PTT is the only one that today exists, and is the one that is being used by NGOs. That is one also used by a large section, by a large host of people who are working with the NGO communities and the international community. However, we haven't seen the similar penetration within the private sector. Why? Because the PTT is not a fully functioning finance institution. They have only 12 branches. They do not have fintech solutions. You have to wait long hours to get access to your money. It doesn't work as a bank. It works as a wiring agent. There is no financial tools and services like credit lines or simple credit and debit accounts. And I think that this is where now Turkey, also from what I've heard, is working on with other actors and looking at how to enhance and to expand the role of the PTT. We've heard and we've seen, and we actually also interviewed banks, Turkish banks that are interested in operating in the area, but they haven't taken yet big, let's say, steps like Ziraat Bank, but also Shaker Bank that seems that could be interested in opening in the area. Other difficulties which seems now we are more better placed to overcome is the certificate of origin. So the certificate of origin is specifically important when you are dealing with countries that require this. So the first news is not all countries actually require one. One of them that doesn't require is the US itself. We also have a large number of countries in Africa and in Asia that do not require certificate of origins. The major problem is that the countries that we used to do trade with, specifically Europe and a little bit in the GCC, do require it. But even then, if you know who you are dealing with, and if you're working in the gross market, there is a way around it as long as you can ship in large quantities. And here we have a catch-22 problem. So if you are a small producers, you definitely need a certificate of origins. But if you are a large producer, you don't need it as much because you can actually ship the whole container on your own risk, and most probably it would pass without any problems. So it's in between where you're stuck, and here you have the catch-22. You cannot go big if you cannot sell while you're small, and then you cannot produce while you're small and sell abroad if you don't have a certificate of origins. But right now, what's happening is most of these small producers are exporting to Iraq, to the KRG, northern Iraq, and also to Libya, to Yemen, which are countries that do not require this kind of documentation, and which also you can market small quantities of production without any hurdles. Moving on, I think this is the last thing that I will end with. The GL22 is an excellent, framework in which we can work. It can help a lot of the companies that would like to be, owned by foreigners or by Syrians diaspora and operate in Western Syria as well, Northern and Eastern Syria. Our colleagues have mentioned how to make it better. The major problem is the overcompliance and de-risking. Most of the banks do not accept GL22. It is not enough, and this is why they are asking for a special license. For example, I take the Siraj, which is a US-funded and financial institution in which also the Syrian Recovery Trust Fund, the SRTF, is as a founder, and also the Middle East Foundation is another co-founder. So they needed to have a specific license, a special license, partially because they started operating before the GL22, but they are still renewing it because the GL22 is not enough for them to still operate and have bank accounts and continue their operations. The SRTF itself, also the Syrian Recovery Trust Fund, even though it does enjoy an extraordinary legal status, still face the same problems today in terms of operating and opening bank accounts. So there need here to be more efforts into convincing the banks of the GL22, doing more reach out activity. Otherwise, it seems that the GL22 is very good on paper, but it has very little effect when it comes at least to finances, which is the most important thing to operate in Northern Eastern Syria, Western Syria, or wherever in the country. Thank you, Omar.
Thank you, Sinan, for this on-the-field expertise of yours and the immense of examples and details provided. I think it was very important to see that what has been done on the field and what are the limitations and what are the opportunities there. And before moving on to the questions from the audience, I have immensely many of them. I want to do a quick round with all of our speakers in the same order, in which I want to pose 5 questions to all of you, and you can pick and choose whichever you want to answer. And also, please feel free to comment or add on anything any other speaker has said, and you want to comment as well. So my 5 questions would be, how can better coordination be facilitated between investors, the US government, the Turkish government, and local authorities? Secondly, what is the potential impact of reduced international humanitarian aid on Syria? How can investments help mitigate these effects? Thirdly, what would be a potential impact of investments on the ongoing conflict in Syria? Fourthly, what is the potential role of the Syrian American diaspora in the pile of investments into Northwest Syria? And lastly, what are the security risks in Northwest Syria that present obstacles for investors, and how can these risks be addressed? I will go with the same order. Kenton, you have the floor.
Thank you. I'll leave some of those for Jumana to answer. But I think what I can say, particularly on the potential impact of investments on the conflict, as Jumana noted, our goal with General License 22 really was to foster economic stabilization in northern Syria. That was particularly areas liberated from ISIS, without which they're very vulnerable to exploitation by ISIS. But I think more broadly, one of the things behind our broader policy in Syria is to stabilize conditions in Syria, throughout Syria, whether through stabilization assistance in non-regime areas or humanitarian assistance throughout the entire country. And our view really has been that supporting greater stabilization throughout Syria and humanitarian access, as well as trying to maintain ceasefires and reduce violence, ensuring ISIS can't resurge, pursuing accountability and justice, that all of these are ways that we can help create conditions that will enable us to advance a political process, which in our view is the only lasting solution to the Syrian conflict. So investments certainly play a big part, particularly in northern Syria, because it creates an environment there in the north that makes it more conducive for reaching a political resolution. As far as the security challenges, I think my other panelists have well covered those challenges, but the fact remains is that Syria is not in a post-conflict phase. There remain active hostilities in the country. Sure, conflict lines have remained largely the same, but there still remains violence in the country, as well as more broadly instability, and that certainly affects the political risk for investors going in. And I mean, as well, Syria remains a designated state sponsor of terrorism. Terrorist groups remain active in the country. There's always a risk of spillover, both from Syria to other parts of the region, but also, as we've been seeing with this latest crisis in the region, potential for spillover into Syria. And so all of those certainly have an impact more broadly on the investment climate there in Syria. So it's certainly part of our policy, and one of the things we want to try to get at with General License 22, and we certainly appreciate all of the feedback and on sort of how GL22 continues to be obstructed by sort of limitations, either from the general license or from other factors in the country. But one of the things that we really want to try to do is to use this as part of a holistic strategy to try to move toward a resolution to this conflict. And certainly, I think greater investment in northern Syria is certainly going to play a key part in enabling that. So I think I'll leave it with that. I mean, I think Jumana covered sort of how this relates to what's happening on the humanitarian assistance front. But yeah, no, it's certainly something that we'd like to see. And certainly, I think more broadly in terms of cooperation, is something that we definitely want to cooperate more with Turkish government, with the Syrian interim government, with others there on. The only other thing I will address is Sinan's point about overcompliance and de-risking. That is certainly a huge challenge, and it's frankly it's a complicated and complex challenge. I think as maybe was pretty evident, we have a lot of sanctions regulations, not only specific to Syria, but others that also relate to Syria, such as our counterterrorism sanctions, and navigating that can be a challenge, as well as just the process for applying for licenses, whether on the export side or the sanction side. It is a process, and certainly I think the challenge is that for a lot of banks, especially smaller intermediary banks, it's not worth the risk. And so I think the challenge for us has been trying to find ways to make our sanctions clearer, trying to find ways to through public messaging, especially to encourage banks to authorize these transactions, to sort of clarify that yes, general license does allow you to facilitate these transactions, which I think has been the key risk. And then trying to find ways to continue to stress the point that due diligence really is necessary, but also at the same time, trying to say that, look, the general license does provide you all the comfort that you need to facilitate this. So that's an ongoing conversation that we're having with NGOs, with banks, but certainly it is a huge challenge.
Okay, thanks, Jumana.
Yeah, I mean, just to build off of what my colleague said and address something actually that the ambassador rightfully pointed out. Serious problems are certainly not going to be addressed with GL22. That was not, we are still, looking to UN Security Council Resolution 2254 as our primary vehicle for the, resolution of the greater, the Syrian conflict. We understand that we are not going to see large number of Syrians return back to their country, and that things are going to be thriving as a result of GL22 or as a result of any, I think, investments in the short to medium term. I think that, our posture is, what can we do in areas where we know the Assad regime is not there? What can we do to help remove some of the regulatory frameworks, the regulatory restrictions that we know, won't end up facilitating money into Assad's hands, but rather might help stimulate investments in some key areas. As I noted earlier, our current, our geographic areas are there, but they're always, there's always room to change those in the future if, certain human rights abuses and things like that that we mentioned are addressed. I know that some of our senior leadership has mentioned this before. And so we certainly don't mean for this to be a solution for how the people in northern Syria are going to live. Obviously, the best way for that is for them to live in peace and dignity and justice and with a 2254 that has been implemented, UN Security Council Resolution 2254 that's been implemented. So moving on from that, I just wanted to make sure to address that. We're also keenly aware, as I mentioned, the humanitarian funding is most likely, we're going to see a drop in that over coming years, just given the vast amounts of conflicts that we've seen, unfold over the last year in Gaza and also the neighborhood. We're aware that there are, 4 to 6 million Syrians in Turkey. We're aware of the Syrians in Jordan, Syrians in Lebanon, in countries where they are struggling with their own economic tribulations. And so we're keenly aware of all of this. And so that is why the hope is that for those who do want to return back to northern Syria, that they are out of their own, of course, volition, can return and have some hope of creating their own businesses, enterprises, or working with others outside of the country who may be interested in that. And figuring out, working through those challenges are absolutely, we know, for example, the Syrian interim government is working on, as Sinan mentioned, working on addressing some of these obstacles, but this will take time because, these are also, local, the local governance in a lot of these areas has been targeted by the Assad regime for years and has suffered, many setbacks, including a decrease in funding for those governance schemes. And so those local governance apparatuses. And so we're aware of the challenges and are just trying to do our best to address that. Beyond that, I just to note real quickly on the Syrian diaspora, a diaspora that has been very involved since, I think, the early days of the Syrian uprising. And many of them, like I said, have come and shared their own experiences with US government officials, and I know elsewhere in Europe, et cetera, and have been making really a lot of effort to understand what the local needs are, try to understand what investors need that are outside, and try to link the two and create, a mechanism that makes sense given all the obstacles that we discussed. And so, for that, I think I applaud their efforts, and I hope that we, together, all the governments that would like to see a resolution to the Syrian conflict, all the governments that are dealing with, high numbers of Syrian refugees, I think this is a great step forward in trying to address at least the needs of Syrians who are willing to go back to northern Syria and give back to that country, or those Syrians who never left, to give them a reason to stay and to continue developing and addressing, their own family and community needs. Over to you.
Ambassador? You are muted. Ambassador, you're muted.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I don't think that I'm going to add anything new on what I said, but I can repeat what I said in different words, maybe. Basically, the starting point for me is that the crisis in Syria is not over. Far from being over. And there are so many challenges that could really lead to a new, even bigger explosion. So I think the objective of the international community should be focused on doing the best not to cause that. That's the declaration of the obvious, definitely. But that's how it goes. How to deal with the dozens, hundreds of challenges that exist. And security challenge, of course, is only one of them. Again, in the security field, which is one of the main obstacles for any potential investment or any potential investor, security deficiency is a major challenge. But then I think I would not really focus only on one particular organization when drawing my policies, because ISIS is a big threat for all of us. It's not a challenge, it's a big threat, but it's not the only one. There are other security threats, security challenges. So I think our focus should be multi-dimensional, multi-organizational. Now, the objective, as I said, is to help Syrians to establish, I wouldn't call it a normal life under these abnormal conditions. It's impossible to establish a normal life, unfortunately, but to carry them a step closer to a normal life. I think this is what we should be aiming to do. And one of the basic needs for that, necessities for that, is cooperation. I think there is a lack of cooperation between main actors involved here. I think our Syrian friends who are directly engaged in the region should be much better aware about that. But more cooperation is needed between the countries in question. Geographic proximity of that area to Turkey actually is a very important advantage. Going back to 2011, just before the crisis, the war started, I remember the numerous projects in so many fields between Syria and Turkey, and really the north part of Syria was the major beneficiary from these projects, just by the definition or by nature of proximity. And I think this proximity is still a big advantage for the Syrians. We have millions, 4 or 5 million people living in these areas, and really what we want to do is to keep them there in good conditions, as close as possible to something normal, and improve their daily lives. also at the same time to pave the way for the Syrians living abroad to go back to their homelands. But in order to do that, I think we can only look forward for smaller steps now, growing in time, hopefully. But then I think one of the most important things is to expand the scope of the instruments that we are applying, such as the General License 22 that we have been talking about for the last hour here. And I think expansion of the geographic area that it covers, I took note definitely of what you pointed out, what several speakers pointed out. But I think an expansion of the geographical scope would very much help to achieve the objectives of General License 22 and similar efforts. Thank you.
Sinan?
Yeah, thank you, Omer. And I would like to build on what Ambassador Omer said about the lack of collaboration and cooperation among different actors, who are all in theory allied to the Syrian people and also to the opposition. And here I'm speaking beyond the point of security aspects and concerns, which I understand how difficult sometimes they are to address. But so to be realistic, there is a global economic problems at this time. So we cannot expect the international community to come and rebuild parts of Syria. And that's without taking consideration anyway the legality of this, because we haven't yet reached a political agreement, and that's also without touching on the feasibility part of it, because why would we reconstruct part of Syria, which is historically maybe the least developed one and the least populated one for a reason. So if we do start reconstructing this part of Syria, and then after a few years, for any reason, we end up back with one territorial integrated country, then we will find us with duplicated infrastructure. So the idea about or any expectations to see huge money being funneled into northern Western Syria or Eastern Syria to reestablish the local structure is not only unrealistic, it is also simply logical when it comes to the need of the country. But what we need is more how to help the Syrian diaspora, how to help the Syrian business community to come in and to take things on their own. And here they are the ones who understand the DNA, the economic DNA of the regions, but better than anyone else. Like, why would I need, for example, to have cotton weavers in Azaz, where there is no cottons being grown and cultivated in the area? I would need it more, for example, in Tal Abyad or Ras Al Ain, or maybe in Qamishli, where there is actually cotton. Same goes for oil pressers, same goes for other strategic investments. So we have to intervene via what is compatible with the economic DNA of each region, and the best ones to be able to do this is the local private sector, who knows actually what works and what doesn't work. So here I believe the international community, instead of looking at how to invest, is looking at how to allow others to invest and how to allow others to work with each other. And despite all this, territorial, difficulties, we still witness a lot of trade happening between this different regions, northwest, eastern Syria, bilateral trade, but also with the regime areas, and they are growing. How we can help in this particular area is how we remove hurdles because this kind of trade is extremely expensive, because each party is putting fees on the transport and transportation of goods from point X to Y. And this is where negotiation should happen, regardless of what's happening on the political track, is how can I help these different local actors to come to a common agreement on facilitating cross-border or cross-frontline trades. And this is where we haven't seen enough efforts. We've seen some glimpse of hopes, like, for example, talking about how to help education, unify again one sort or another, but we haven't heard enough of it about trades. And it's a very tricky topic because we are dealing with warlords here in different kinds. So it is not an easy one to tackle, but we haven't seen any effort in tackling it. We only seen and heard about complaints about it, but not real solutions. I think also the other thing the international community should help foster is how we can create collaboration among the local actors themselves. If I am producing oil here, how can I use it there? So we do not duplicate our efforts. We have very little money, and resources available within the local business community and the one in diaspora. So we should be even smarter in how to spend it. Being smart in spending this money is how we can actually negotiate with each other, a value chain that is large enough to benefit a lot of members of the business community and create a better impact on the local communities, and is a little bit agnostic to the difficulties in terms of political track as well as the military one. Eventually, as Ambassador Omer said very well, this is not the end of the Syrian conflict. We haven't yet seen the reasons why this conflict started in the first place still exist and have even, exacerbated. They are much more pressing and still are threatening the future of the country. So we're gonna witness a second and third and a fourth round till this structural problem are solved. However, what we should be looking at is, and this may be the last thing, is how this efforts are resilient in their output. They are flexible, agile, and they can work under in different circumstances. And here is also, instead of big and centralized, is small and decentralized. So this is what I will end with. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Sinan. I want to go over to the questions from the audience. I have plenty of them. I will be quick, and there are many questions, about a dozen questions about oil, which we have not covered so far. And there are many questions. Why is oil not wavered? What's the potential of oil? Couldn't be investments be made into oil? And how could oil help recover the economy in Syria? And in this regard, I want to ask Ambassador Ernhon and Kenton, what do you think about this oil issue? Please go ahead, Ambassador, and then Kenton. You are muted, Ambassador.
Thank you. That is an important issue, really. I mean, oil is they used to produce around 380,000 barrels a day in Syria before the war. I mean, that's not really a big amount compared to countries like Saudi Arabia, but it is a big amount for Syria, and especially now that oil is needed very much by the Syrian people. I mean, there is a fatigue in the international community where there are so many crises all over the world that the international community really don't have enough resources to reach out to each one of these conflicts. Now, many countries in distress will have to do with their own resources, and oil is what Syria has. But unfortunately, the oil now is not used for the Syrian people, or is in the area in the east of Euphrates under the control of SDG, YPG. and this group is using oil for their own political and military purposes. But this oil in reality belongs to the Syrian people, and in an environment where there is big international fatigue for any financial assistance, I think the oil which belongs to all the Syrian people should be used for the benefit of all the Syrian people. And there are several ideas and projects to this effect. So I think that issue should be addressed by the international community. I mean, you have the needed resources over there, you have the needed potential financial resources over there, but unfortunately, it is controlled by a certain group for their own political and military purposes. And really, I don't think Syria can afford this luxury at a time of distress at this extent.
Okay, and Kenton, what would you say about this issue?
Yes, so there are a few things that I can say. The first that I will note is just going back to sort of what our sanctions specifically prohibit. So they prohibit the new and sort of more broadly, unless otherwise authorized by a general license, they prohibit the importation into the United States of petroleum or petroleum products of Syrian origin, and they prohibit any transaction or dealing by a U.S. person in or related to petroleum or petroleum products of Syrian origin. So I just want to set that as sort of the scope of what our sanctions regulations actually prohibit versus what they don't prohibit. And then, of course, as mentioned earlier, the Caesar Act prohibits transactions, significant transactions with the government of Syria, or support significant material, technological, or financial support to the government of Syria, and that includes related to petroleum. As far as the general license is concerned, general licenses, as with our Syrian sanctions regulations, generally apply to U.S. persons or to transactions happening inside the U.S. Our policy has been that the United States does not own, control, or manage Syrian energy resources, and we don't have any intention of doing that. We firmly believe Syrian oil is for the Syrian people. And so our general license broadly is intended to be part of a comprehensive strategy to ensure that ISIS does not resurge, to generally facilitate economic stabilization in areas outside of regime control. So just sort of understanding the scope of what our general license does cover and sort of who it specifically applies to, I think there's certainly, I think, space for non-U.S. persons to certainly come in and help in terms of sort of broader economic activity there. And again, the Caesar Act, as it exists, it's really meant to go after the government of Syria and its backers, Russia and Iran. It's not meant to sort of target the Syrian people in general, not meant to restrict Syrians from being able to have livelihoods and sort of broader improve our humanitarian conditions there. But I will say, as far as U.S. policy is concerned, no, the general license does not sort of specifically include an authorization for activities in the oil and gas sector. And again, that is because our policy has been that we don't control or own or manage Syrian oil, and that's not something the United States has any intention of doing. But again, that said, the general license, it's still pretty broad, and our sanctions regulations are pretty broad. Anything that's covered under our general license, there's no risk of anyone engaging in those activities being able to, being at risk of sanctions under the Caesar Act. So that's probably as much as I can say about that. Again, we welcome feedback and certainly welcome ongoing conversation to consider how to expand the general license. But I think on the oil and gas issue, that's particularly something that I think, given our policy, that's kind of where we're going to be at. And apologies for the background noise.
Yes, next to you, Jomana, there are two questions specifically for you. The first is about the security situation. You spoke about security situation, and someone from the audience asked, what is the exact security risk? From where are they emancipating, and what could be done, or from where, and what could be done to address these security risks, especially in regards to investment? And the second question is, why is Afrin not included? I think we touch upon this a little bit, but I would like you to expand on this, especially our audience asked, considering that the exclusion of Afrin will make the lives for the people in these areas less good than areas which are included in the waiver. And also, this is a question, could make Afrin open to potential attacks from terrorist groups such as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. What would you say on these two issues?
So, I mean, on the first question, of course, in Northwest Syria, we have attacks, and there was a noticeable uptick in attacks by the Syrian regime over those, several months, course of several months. I think because of the Gaza-Israel situation, a lot of people haven't really paid attention to the state of Northwest Syria, but we've definitely been tracking. But even beyond that, obviously, the security situation and the Assad regime and its allies, Russia and Iran, have been very active and haven't really, suspended their operations there, even though we do believe that overall the number had decreased for quite some time. But the people in Idlib and in Northwest Syria in general are constantly exposed to attacks on civilian infrastructure, on the medical staff there. It's not a safe situation by any means. And in Northeast Syria, you do have, there are attacks, and some of which have been, that the U.S. government has expressed concern about by the Turkish government for various, that have resulted in destruction of various civilian infrastructure. I'm not going to go into all that here. I know our chief diplomats and a variety of our, senior leadership have been, in discussions of this. And the good thing is, in Northeast Syria, we have seen a decline over recent months in that. And but I think in general, if you're looking at this from an investment perspective, you obviously want more than a couple of months or a few months of safety in order to put your money in it and say, I'm going to invest in this particular area or this particular business. And so we hope, like I said in my opening comments, that maintaining ceasefires is one of our 4 pillars of our Syria strategy. And we sincerely believe that very little can move forward while that's ongoing, while ceasefires are being violated. I'm really sorry, this church is going to, I don't know if you can hear the bells, but I live right next to a church, so the bells are going to keep ringing. Briefly on Afrin, as I said earlier, there were human rights and there remain human rights concerns that the U.S. government has about that particular area, but not just that area, as I said, in Idlib as well. Of course, we believe that investment it could be helpful in those areas, but our problem is also not, how do I say it? Not to facilitate investments in areas that we do have concerns about that were not fully addressed or that were not ameliorated. And this is something that we've talked to with a lot of different local actors. I know different armed groups that might have taken part in these. We have let them know that these are the issues we are concerned with, and these are the kinds of things that would help make it better. So, like I said, it's not a firm position that can never be reversed or changed. But basically, that's my point on that. If they're addressed, these kinds of areas would absolutely be contemplated. But while Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is there, I just don't see that changing, at least in the parts of Idlib that I mentioned.
Okay, thanks. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. There were so many questions, but it was really great talking to you. And I want to thank you all so much, Captain Slaughter, CRS of Spain State Department Office of Levant Affairs, Jomana Hadou, the Senior Syria Advisor in the State Department Office of Levant Affairs, and Ambassador Ömer Önhan, the last Turkish ambassador to Syria and a board member of the Ankara Police Center in Turkey, and also Sinan Hatahat, non-residential senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and the vice president for investment and social impact at the Syrian Forum. And I want to thank you, our audience, and apologize for being unable to take all of the questions. There were many, but please follow the excellent work of our speakers, but also follow Syria Project and follow Atlantic Council to be on, to know our new events coming up. And I want to thank you all and wish you all a great day.
Thank you.